The snow didn't creak, it screamed. Detective Grace Sullivan's boots broke through the fresh powder like cracking bones beneath a white shroud. Everything about that morning in Millbrook Falls felt wrong. The air was too still, the light too pale, and her canine partner, Ranger, wasn't walking beside her. He was staring, frozen, fixated. That alone was enough to turn Grace's blood cold. They were supposed to be on a routine patrol, a final round through the sleepy little town she had served for 25 years. In just 6 weeks, she was set to retire. Her badge would go into a glass case, her name etched on a plaque, and she'd be handed a slice of cake in the station break room with an awkward speech about her years of service. But retirement meant one thing, leaving behind the one case she'd never cracked. And Grace Sullivan refused to go out with ghosts clawing at her back. 4 years. That's how long it had been since Hannah and Hope Carter, twin sisters in matching red coats, vanished from Millbrook Falls Park on Christmas Eve. Their mother, Beth, had gone into the corner store for no more than 10 minutes. When she came out, the girls were gone. No screams, no signs of struggle, not even a set of footprints. Just an empty bench where two 7-year-olds had been tossing snowballs moments before. The case suffocated the town like the Minnesota winter, silent, bitter, and unforgiving. Everyone moved on, everyone except Grace. "Ranger," she called softly, adjusting her scarf and stepping carefully over a half-buried fence. "Talk to me, boy." The German shepherd didn't flinch. His hackles were up, ears pinned forward, nose twitching like a wire under pressure. He let out a single sharp bark that sliced through the morning air like a blade. Grace's hand instinctively moved to her hip, unbuttoning the strap over her holster. "Where is it?" she whispered. Ranger lunged, not far, just 15 feet, to the base of a snow-covered slope behind the old Methodist church. There, nearly buried in a patch of brittle weeds and broken bricks, sat a half-collapsed storm cellar door, its hinges rusted and swollen from decades of neglect. Ranger barked again, pawing frantically at the warped wood, his body tense as a live wire. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. The church had been boarded up since the last pastor retired 3 years ago. No services, no parishioners, no reason anyone should be snooping around here in the middle of a snowstorm. She pulled a flashlight from her belt and stepped cautiously toward the cellar. "Easy, boy," she said, but the words came out thin. The door groaned as she pulled it open. A gust of musty, frozen air hit her like a slap. Inside, the space was pitch dark and crammed with junk, rotting crates, broken chairs, crumbling hymn books. She swept her light across the clutter and paused. There, tucked beneath a half-collapsed shelf, was a small pink glove. Perfectly intact, perfectly clean. Grace froze. For a moment, all she could hear was her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. She knew that glove. Beth Carter had shown her dozens of photos of Hannah and Hope in the days after their disappearance. The girls had been wearing matching red coats, white earmuffs, and pink gloves with little embroidered hearts. Beth had bought them for Christmas that year, her last gift before the world unraveled. Grace crouched and reached out, her hand trembling. She picked up the glove and turned it over in her palm, then held it under the flashlight. No rips, no weathering, no signs of age. This glove hadn't been sitting here for 4 winters. It was fresh. "Ranger," she whispered, her voice tight. The dog whined and pressed his nose to the floor near the glove, then looked up at her as if to say, "You see it now, too." Grace reached into her jacket and pulled out an evidence bag, carefully sliding the glove inside. Her fingers, already numb from the cold, fumbled as she sealed the bag. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. This was real. This was a clue. And if it was real, then someone had been down here, recently. She stood up slowly, flashlight trembling in her hand. A rush of adrenaline surged through her limbs, followed by a creeping sense of dread. She hadn't been this close to a lead in years, not since the town stopped looking, not since the sheriff closed the case, not since people started whispering that maybe the mother had something to do with it. Grace had never believed that. Beth Carter wasn't a murderer. She was a mother who had lost everything and never gave up hope. Grace couldn't retire and leave her with nothing but shadows. She stepped outside the cellar and pulled her radio to call it in. But then she paused. Sheriff Bradley had made it clear. No new evidence, no reopening the case. He'd already told Grace she was too emotionally attached, too close to it. If she called this in without backup, without a solid lead to tie it to, the sheriff would toss it into the evidence locker and forget it. She looked down at Ranger. The dog stared up at her, his intelligent brown eyes unblinking, as if he were reading her thoughts. "No one believes me," she muttered, mostly to herself. "But you do, don't you?" Ranger wagged his tail once and nudged her boot with his nose. She pocketed the glove, zipped her jacket, and walked back to the cruiser. They needed to be careful. If someone was still hiding the girls, if this glove meant what she thought it did, then someone had gotten away with the perfect crime. Until now. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, the glove resting inside its evidence bag beneath the glow of a single lamp. Her house was quiet. No TV, no music, just the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall, and Ranger curled at her feet, asleep but twitching in his dreams. On the table were old case files, dozens of them filled with photos, statements, maps, and theories. She'd gone over them 100 times before, but something was different now. The glove had changed everything. She flipped open their first file, a photo of Hannah and Hope smiling in the snow, their cheeks red from cold, each holding a matching pink glove. Grace stared at the photo, then at the bag on the table. Not a coincidence, not this time. She reached into the file and pulled out a map of Millbrook Falls, spreading it across the table. The old Methodist church was marked. A red X circled the park, another at the Carter House. She added a new mark, the storm cellar. The first real link in 4 years. Then she reached for a fresh notebook and wrote one word at the top of the page. Why now? The town had gone silent on the case years ago. No suspects, no movement, no sightings. But if someone had come back, if someone had placed that glove, were they trying to lure someone in or send a message? She didn't have the answer. Not yet. But she had something better. She had Ranger, and she had one last case. Sheriff Thomas Bradley leaned against the doorway of Grace Sullivan's office, arms crossed, brow furrowed. The morning sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, catching dust in the air and casting pale streaks across the worn carpet. On Grace's desk sat a plastic evidence bag. Inside it, the pink glove she'd found in the church cellar. "Grace," the sheriff said, voice low but firm, "I've seen 1,000 gloves like that. That could belong to any girl in this town." Grace didn't look up. She was flipping through a worn manila folder labeled Carter Twins, Case 2274. Her fingers trailed down the faded photographs of Hannah and Hope, dressed in their red winter coats and, yes, pink gloves. "It's not just a glove, Tom," she said. "It's the glove. Beth showed me these photos more times than I can count. Those gloves were a Christmas gift, special ordered. Little heart stitches on the cuffs. You're telling me it's just a coincidence?" Bradley exhaled sharply and walked into the room. "I'm telling you, we can't reopen a case based on one glove found in a basement that's probably been used as a dump for the last 10 years. Grace finally met his eyes. "Then don't reopen it. I will investigate it on my own time. I've got 6 weeks left on this badge, and I'm not going to spend them filing paperwork while 2 little girls stay missing." Ranger, lying beside her desk, lifted his head and let out a quiet huff, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, like he too was waiting for an answer. Tom studied Grace for a moment, and for the first time in years, she saw a flicker of doubt in his face. "I'm not stopping you," he said at last, "but keep it quiet. No news alerts. No stirring up the town unless you find something solid. Beth, she's barely getting her footing back. Don't give her false hope." Grace nodded, jaw tight. False hope is pretending the case is closed when it's not. That afternoon, Grace parked her cruiser on Maple Street, just outside the weather-worn Carter home. The snow had turned slushy underfoot, revealing patches of brown grass and gravel. Wind chimes danced gently on the porch, though there wasn't a breeze in the air. Beth Carter answered the door in a faded blue hoodie and jeans. Her once blonde hair was streaked with gray, pulled back in a messy knot. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "Grace," she said, surprise and wariness in her voice. "Is everything... Are you here about..." "I found something," Grace said quietly. "Can I come in?" Beth nodded, stepping aside. Inside, the house was frozen in time. The living room walls were lined with photographs of the girls. School portraits, birthday parties, a beach trip long ago. Their rooms, Grace knew, had never been touched. Every stuffed animal was still in place. Every storybook still stacked by the bed. Beth poured them coffee and sat across the table. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around the mug. "What did you find?" she whispered. Grace placed the sealed bag gently on the table. Beth stared at it, her breath caught. That's Hannah's. Or Hope's. I can't tell whose was whose. Grace nodded. I thought so too. I found it in the basement of the old Methodist church. Ranger led me straight there. Beth blinked, stunned. That church has been closed for 3 years. You think someone was hiding them there? Grace hesitated. I don't know. Not yet. But someone's been inside that basement recently. The glove's in near-perfect condition. Beth stood suddenly and crossed the room. From a small wooden box, she pulled out a photo. The twins on Christmas morning, 4 years ago, beaming in front of the tree, pink gloves on their hands. She handed it to Grace. They wore them to the park that afternoon. They had them on when they disappeared. There was silence. Grace could hear the hum of the old refrigerator, the creak of Ranger stretching near the door. Beth whispered, "Do you think they're alive?" Grace looked her in the eye. "I think someone wanted us to find that glove. And if someone's still playing games 4 years later, it means there's something worth hiding." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat on her couch, Ranger's head resting on her knee, and stared at the wall of case files she'd reassembled in her living room. Photographs, maps, news clippings, copies of every witness statement, all pinned neatly across two corkboards. She stared at the timeline. December 24th, 21, 2:42 p.m. Bev Carter enters the corner store. 2:53 p.m. Bev exits. Girls are gone. No screams, no struggle. No one saw a thing. Between those 11 minutes, two children vanished from a public park in daylight. She closed her eyes and recalled the early days. The helicopters, the canine units, the national news trucks, the candlelight vigils, and then the silence. When nothing turned up, people grew tired. They stopped asking questions. They started saying maybe it was the mother. Maybe it was a stranger passing through. Maybe the girls had wandered off into the woods. Grace never believed any of that. And Ranger, he'd never stopped searching. Not really. She rose and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Gentle now. Peaceful. She remembered something Dorothy Henderson had said during the original interviews, a widowed woman who lived near the church. "I saw someone going into that church late at night," the woman had told her. "Big man, carried bags, thought it was just the pastor dropping off food." Grace had dismissed it at the time. Everyone loved Reverend William Thornton. He'd officiated weddings, buried friends, baptized half the children in Millbrook Falls. His departure had been sudden. Early retirement due to grief, they said. His granddaughter had died in a car accident 6 months before the twins vanished. And then he disappeared. Grace frowned. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door. Dorothy Henderson answered the door in a thick cardigan and orthopedic slippers. She squinted through her glasses. "Grace Sullivan, I figured you'd come eventually." "You heard?" Dorothy motioned for her to come inside. "Everyone's heard. Small town, you know." They sat in the parlor, lit by the soft glow of an antique lamp. Dorothy poured hot water into chipped teacups and handed one over. "I was right, wasn't I?" the old woman said. "About the church." Grace nodded. "Looks that way." Dorothy's eyes hardened. "He was in there at night, for months after the girls disappeared. I saw him. Told the sheriff. He said I was seeing things." "What was he carrying?" "Bags. Boxes. Once I saw a toy, pink, with ribbons. Another time, I swear I saw food, canned goods." Grace's pulse quickened. "You're sure it was him?" "I'd know that man's walk anywhere. He baptized my daughter." Grace finished her tea and stood. "If he was using that church to hide something, then we've only scratched the surface." As she stepped outside into the snow, Ranger at her side, Grace turned back to the house. Dorothy stood at the door, a silhouette against the warm light. "Find them, detective," she said, "before he moves them again." Grace nodded. She didn't say goodbye. She and Ranger walked into the falling snow, heading toward the church once more. Because something told her they were close, very close. The wind howled down Main Street like a ghost looking for home. Grace Sullivan parked 2 blocks from the old Methodist church, her cruiser's tires crunching softly over frozen gravel. It was just after 10 p.m. Millbrook Falls had gone to sleep, porch lights off, curtains drawn, chimneys puffing smoke into the starless sky. But for Grace and her canine partner, Ranger, this was the beginning of a long night. She sat in the car a moment longer, staring at the dark outline of the church. This wasn't official police work. No one had authorized this visit. She hadn't pulled a warrant, but she couldn't wait anymore. Not after what Dorothy Henderson had told her. A former reverend sneaking into an abandoned church late at night, carrying toys, food, and pink ribbons. Someone had to care enough to open that door. Grace stepped out into the cold, pulled her hood up, and clipped her flashlight to her jacket. "Let's go," she whispered. Ranger hopped out beside her, nose twitching, tail still. They approached the side entrance. The church loomed like a forgotten sentinel from a better time. Paint peeling, wood swelling, windows fogged with grime. A faded sign still hung near the doors. Millbrook Falls Methodist, all are welcome. Grace tried the knob. Locked. She crouched low, scanning the base of the building. Snow had piled up along the foundation, but the familiar scent of decay hit her fast. Mildew, dust, and something else. Something off. Ranger let out a low growl. To the left, a boarded-up cellar door sat nearly buried beneath a drift. The same one from last week. She knelt down, brushing snow away with her gloves. The wood had buckled slightly more, and something had shifted. New tracks were visible. Very faint, but undeniably fresh. Adult boots. Possibly a second set, smaller. "Someone's been back," she whispered. Ranger sniffed the ground, then moved toward the corner of the building. His tail went rigid. He growled again, this time louder. Grace's pulse kicked. They weren't alone. She forced open the cellar door. It gave with a groan loud enough to make her flinch, revealing a steep stairway descending into dark silence. Grace pulled her flashlight, unholstered her service weapon, and motioned for Ranger to stay close. Each step creaked under her boots as they descended. The smell intensified, damp wood, mold, and something metallic. Her beam landed on the cluttered space below. Piles of hymnals, broken chairs, ancient candles. Cobwebs laced every corner. But then she saw it, the same pile of lumber and debris where she'd found the glove. It was different now. Someone had moved it. Grace knelt, brushing the pile aside, revealing a section of the floor with slightly uneven boards. She tapped lightly, hollow. Ranger stood beside her, whining. She pried at the loose planks. With a sharp crack, one lifted, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to crawl through. A breath of cold air rose from beneath, and behind it, darkness. She turned to Ranger. "Go?" The German shepherd didn't hesitate. He crouched and crawled into the space first, his body disappearing into the void. Grace followed, her flashlight beam darting wildly across stone and shadow. They emerged into a crawl space, tighter than she expected. The floor was stone, the ceiling low, and the walls? Grace's heart stopped. Children's drawings, dozens of them, taped with care to the walls, crayon rainbows, trees, stars, and two little girls holding hands, drawn again and again. In one, a tall figure stood behind them, a stick man with a square around his neck, a collar. Reverend Thornton. In another, the same two girls drew a circle of animals. One dog in particular stood out, colored dark with a diamond on its back. Ranger. Her flashlight shook. Ranger had only been assigned to her unit 2 years ago, 2 years after the Carter twins disappeared. Yet he was in the drawings. How? She pressed on. The tunnel sloped downward, leading into what looked like a makeshift bunker. Blankets, small plastic plates, children's books, all meticulously arranged in miniature domestic order. She stepped forward, slowly examining every detail. One shelf held cans of peaches, beans, and condensed soup, all neatly stacked. Another had flashlights, bandages, and a portable radio. On the wall, a handmade calendar marked days with colored stars and smiley faces. The most recent mark? 3 days ago. Grace's knees weakened, her breath clouded in the cold air. This wasn't just some abandoned hiding place. This had been lived in, recently. "Dear God," she whispered. Ranger sniffed around a child-sized mattress, whining again. He nudged a blue notebook partially hidden under a pillow. Grace knelt, opened it carefully. The handwriting was childish but neat. Inside were entries, journal-style pages signed H and H. "Papa William says the flood is almost over. He says we'll be allowed to see the stars again soon." Another. "We are the chosen ones. We were saved from the fire and flood. Papa said God made an ark just for us." And another. "Sometimes I hear the Twal in my dreams. I think he's real. I think he's coming to find us." Grace felt her chest tighten. The twins were alive, or had been. They'd been kept here, trapped, lied to. This was more than kidnapping, it was indoctrination. He hadn't just stolen them, he had brainwashed them. She closed the journal with shaking hands, sliding it into her evidence bag. "We have to move," she whispered to Ranger. The dog barked once, softly, and trotted toward the far side of the bunker. There, behind a stack of boxes, another narrow opening. Ranger pushed his nose against it and growled. Grace crouched, flashlight trembling, and saw scratch marks on the stone as if something or someone had been moving through it often. They returned to the surface by dawn. Grace radioed Sheriff Bradley the moment they were clear. Within hours, the entire area was swarming with uniforms, search dogs, and forensic teams. Bradley stood over the drawing, stunned. "This was under the church the whole time?" he whispered. Grace nodded. "The girls were here, Tom, recently." He ran a hand through his hair. "How the hell did we miss this?" "We didn't miss it," she replied. "We were told to stop looking." Bradley didn't argue. He handed her a fresh file folder. New evidence from a deeper background check on Reverend William Thornton. Old land records, utility bills, a second property. North of town. North of town, he said, near the limestone quarries. He bought it under a shell name 3 years ago. Grace stared at the file. "He's got another place," she said quietly. Bradley nodded. "And if he's still moving them..." Grace didn't wait for permission. She grabbed Ranger's leash. "Let's go finish this." The sun was barely peeking over the tree line as Grace Sullivan floored the accelerator on the county road north of Millbrook Falls. The landscape flew by in a blur of gray rock, frozen fills, and brittle pine trees. Ranger stood tall in the passenger seat, ears alert, nose twitching at the crack of the slightly open window. They were headed for a property listed under a shell name, purchased 3 years ago by someone using an address that traced back to Reverend William Thornton. It wasn't on the maps, no house number, just a lot on the edge of a long abandoned limestone quarry. Grace had a sick feeling in her gut the entire drive. This was his ark, not the church. That was just a front, a training ground, a waiting room. This place, wherever it was where he'd built the world he wanted the girls to live in. The gravel cracked under the tires as the cruiser crept along a narrow access road. Trees arched over the path like skeletal arms. Grace slowed the car, scanning for any sign of movement. There wasn't even a mailbox, just a rusted chain draped across 2 stone posts, a hand-painted "No Trespassing" sign swinging in the wind. Grace parked, unhooked Ranger's leash, and grabbed her flashlight and sidearm. "Stay close, buddy," she said, voice low. "Let's end this." They ducked under the chain and moved quietly down a snow-dusted trail. Ranger stopped every few steps to sniff the air, then moved again. Focused, determined. After 10 minutes of walking, they found it. A steel hatch built into the ground near a rock outcrop, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Grace crouched and touched the handle. It was cold, but not frozen. It had been opened recently. Her flashlight beam revealed faint shoe prints in the snow, some small, child-sized. Ranger growled softly. Grace's heart pounded. "This is it," she whispered. She reached for her radio to call in backup, but stopped. No signal. The rock walls of the quarry blocked everything. She could wait and risk the girls being moved again, or she could go in. She looked down at Ranger. The dog's eyes were locked on the hatch, his body tense, ready. "We go," she said. The hatch opened with a loud metallic creak. Inside, a narrow concrete stairwell led downward into darkness. A single exposed light bulb flickered overhead. The air was damp, stale, and carried a faint chemical smell: bleach, gasoline, metal. Grace drew her weapon and descended slowly, Ranger padding silently beside her. At the bottom, they emerged into a crude tunnel system, reinforced with wooden beams and lined with plastic sheeting. A series of lanterns lit the way, their battery-powered glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. The deeper they went, the more surreal it became. One chamber was a makeshift bedroom, with 2 small cots, folded blankets, and stuffed animals lined neatly against the wall. Another was a dining area, low plastic table, mismatched chairs, even children's artwork taped to the walls. One drawing caught Grace's eye. It was a picture of a smiling man in a brown robe with a Bible in one hand and 2 little girls on either side holding his arms. "Papa Williams saves us from the flood." She swallowed hard. They believed it. After 4 years, they didn't see him as a captor. He was their savior, their father, their God. And now Grace was the intruder. Further in, she found another journal, this one written in Thornton's cramped, precise handwriting. Notes on food rations, schooling schedules, emergency drills, bedtime prayers. At the bottom of one page, "When the world is ready, I'll release them, but not yet. They are still unclean." She closed the book with shaking hands. Ranger suddenly froze. Then he bolted. Grace followed, running through the passage, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Ranger barked once, stopped, and crouched near a narrow split in the tunnel wall. There was a hidden passage, and from inside it, singing. Faint, off-key, but unmistakable. Two voices. Children. Grace dropped to her knees and crawled through. On the other side, a cavern opened up, round, domed, and candlelit. The smell of wax and old sweat clung to the air. In the center sat a man in a long, tattered brown robe, reading from a torn Bible, surrounded by flickering candles. His white beard glowed orange in the low light. He rocked gently as he read. Beside him sat two young girls, Hannah and Hope. Their hair was long and tangled, faces pale, cheeks sunken. But their eyes were bright, alive, alert, and fixated on Ranger. The dog stepped forward, cautiously. Hope gasped. "It's the dog from the drawings," she whispered. Hannah clutched her sister's hand. The man looked up, startled. He rose slowly, eyes wide, the Bible dropping from his hands. "You don't belong here," he said, voice rasping. Grace stepped into the room, gun lowered but ready. "I'm not here to hurt them, William." He stared at her. "You shouldn't have come." "They're coming home with me," she said. "No," he whispered. "You'll poison them with your lies. The world out there, it's already dead." Grace took a step forward. "It's not. Their mother is alive. She's been waiting for them every single day, setting two places at the table, reading bedtime stories out loud into silence." Hope's lips trembled. Hannah looked away. William stepped between them. Ranger growled. "I saved them," William shouted. "They were chosen. Do you know what the world would have done to them? The pain, the filth. I gave them peace. I gave them purpose." Grace didn't flinch. "You stole their lives." A pause. Then the man collapsed. His legs gave out and he crumpled to the floor, clutching his chest. "Papa!" both girls screamed. Grace rushed forward, but the girls pushed her back. Hope grabbed a bat from the corner, pulled out a blood glucose monitor. Hannah grabbed a small cooler and withdrew a vial of insulin and a needle. They worked together, fast, practiced. Grace stood frozen, watching as two 11-year-old girls administered emergency care like trained nurses. When it was over, William lay breathing shallowly, eyes glazed. The girls sat beside him, shielding him with their bodies. "He saved us," Hope whispered. "You don't understand." Grace crouched, setting her gun aside. "No," she said, "I don't. But I want to, and I want to help you. I'm not the enemy. Neither is your mom." The girl said nothing. But Ranger took a step forward and laid his head gently in Hope's lap. She didn't pull away. Tears welled in her eyes. "We dreamed about him," she said softly. "He always came to find us, just like now." The sirens came 30 minutes later. Grace had radioed the sheriff when she climbed back above ground. A full SWAT and medical team arrived soon after. William was taken into custody, stabilized but barely conscious. The girls were wrapped in blankets, placed into a warm van with soft seats and juice boxes like some bizarre field trip home from hell. Beth Carter arrived at the hospital an hour later. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob to the exam room where her daughters waited. But when she entered, the girls shrank back, clutching each other. They didn't recognize her. "Is it true?" Hannah whispered to Grace. "Is she really our mom?" Grace placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "She is, and she never stopped loving you." Hope looked down at Ranger. "Did he come from her world too?" Grace nodded. "He's the reason we found you." That night, Grace didn't sleep. She sat on her couch, Ranger by her side, staring at the ceiling. She'd found them, alive. But the real work, the healing, the truth, the relearning of reality was just beginning. For Beth, for the girls, and for Grace herself. Because sometimes finding someone is just the first step. Bringing them home is the real miracle. The sign outside Millbrook Falls General Hospital read, "Heroes come in all sizes." But Grace Sullivan couldn't bring herself to look at it as she walked through the sliding glass doors. The real heroes, in her opinion, were sitting in a secure pediatric room on the 3rd floor, wrapped in hospital gowns, clinging to each other like shipwrecked survivors pulled from the ice. Hannah and Hope Carter were alive, but they weren't free. Not really. Not yet. Grace knew the road ahead would be long. Trauma wasn't just something you walked away from. It followed you like a shadow, even on the brightest days. And the girls had been living in shadows for 4 long years. She stepped off the elevator, coffee in hand, and made her way down the brightly lit corridor. The walls were decorated with colorful murals, balloons, smiling cartoon animals, rainbows stretching across clouds. None of it reached the Carter twins. They sat side by side on a twin bed, back straight, legs dangling, fingers intertwined. 2 mirror images, both pale, eyes darting nervously to every movement outside the room. Hope was slightly more talkative. Hannah watched everything, sizing up every person who entered like she was still underground, still in survival mode. Grace knocked gently and stepped in. Ranger followed at her heels. Hope's face lit up, just slightly when she saw the dog. "You came back," she whispered, sitting up straighter. Ranger padded to her side and placed his head gently in her lap. She stroked his fur with slow, careful fingers. Hannah didn't move. Grace sat across from them in a plastic chair. "How are we doing today?" Hope shrugged. Hannah answered with a single word: cold. "Hospital rooms are always freezing," Grace said, sipping her coffee. "Want me to ask the nurse for another blanket?" Another shrug. "You know," Grace continued, "I used to get in trouble all the time when I was your age for stealing extra blankets. My mom said I was nesting like a squirrel. She'd walk in, and I'd be buried in a mountain of fleece." A small smile flickered across Hope's lips. Grace leaned in. "Do you girls remember hot cocoa?" They exchanged a look. Hope nodded. Hannah stayed silent. "Well," Grace said, standing, "let's see if we can fix the blanket situation first. Cocoa comes next." She walked out, leaving Ranger behind. Outside the room, Beth Carter stood frozen in the hallway, her hands wringing the strap of her purse. Her eyes were red, her lips pale. She looked at Grace like a woman asking for permission to breathe. "They still won't talk to me," Beth said quietly. "They won't even look at me." "They're scared," Grace said. "Everything they knew just got ripped away. You didn't do anything wrong, Beth, but right now you're a stranger to them." Beth nodded slowly. "It's just, I've dreamed of this moment for so long. I thought it would feel like a miracle, but it hurts." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "It is a miracle, but it's also a beginning. You're not just getting your girls back. You're going to have to reintroduce yourself to them. Build trust, one tiny moment at a time." Beth swallowed hard. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive," Grace said. "But yes, I do. With time." She handed Beth a spare hospital visitor badge. "Let's start small. Just sit by the door for now. Let them get used to your presence." Beth nodded and took a seat on a bench nearby. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Over the next few days, the hospital became a sanctuary of routine. The girls saw Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a trauma specialist brought in from Minneapolis 3 times a day. Ranger was allowed to remain with them during sessions. His presence seemed to soften their defenses more than any medication could. They began to talk in fragments. Hope shared more. She asked about movies, about music, about whether ice cream still came in chocolate swirl. Hannah remained guarded, but her eyes followed her mother now when Beth entered the room. She never spoke, but she didn't recoil anymore. On the 4th day, Hope asked, "Do we get to go home?" Dr. Mitchell sat beside her. "Eventually, yes, but we're going to help you remember what home means first." Hannah frowned. "Papa said we already had a home." "Sometimes people lie to keep others under control," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "It doesn't make it your fault for believing them." Hope looked down. "He said the world ended." Grace was in the room that day, leaning against the back wall. She spoke up, voice steady. "Well, if the world ended, nobody told us," she said. "We've still got pizza, grocery stores, traffic, TikTok, and summer baseball." Hope blinked. "What's TikTok?" Grace grinned. "Ask me again in 2 weeks. We'll start with movies. Ever seen Frozen?" They shook their heads. "Well," Grace said, "you're in for a treat." Meanwhile, Reverend William Thornton remained under 24-hour guard in the hospital's high-security ward. He had suffered a minor cardiac episode during the rescue but was expected to recover. The county district attorney had already prepared charges: unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, psychological abuse, obstruction, and more. Grace wasn't interested in the legal process. She'd done her part. Her focus now was on the girls and on Ranger. That night, back at home, she noticed him pacing the living room, restless. He kept going to the front door, then the bedroom, then circling back. "Something's bothering you," she said softly, kneeling beside him. She scratched behind his ears. "You miss them, don't you?" Ranger leaned his head into her shoulder. Grace knew what he felt. That ache, that uncertainty, that question that gnawed at you even after you'd done everything right. Are they going to be okay? She couldn't answer that, but she could stay. The following morning, Grace walked into the hospital room carrying a plastic shopping bag. Inside were 2 small plush animals, one a faded gray bunny, the other a fuzzy yellow duck. She held them out. Beth gasped. "Oh my God, where did you get those?" "You gave them to me," Grace said. "That first week when we searched the woods, you said they liked to sleep with them. I kept them. I guess I wasn't ready to let go." She turned to the girls. "I thought maybe you'd want them back." Hope reached for the bunny. Hannah hesitated, then slowly took the duck and held it to her chest. Beth stood just behind Grace, breath held. Hannah looked up. For the first time in 4 years, she spoke directly to her mother. "I remember this," she whispered. "You sewed the button back on." Beth covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. "Yes," she choked out, "I did." Hope looked from her sister to her mother, then back again. "Can we go outside?" she asked suddenly. "Just for a little while, with Ranger?" That afternoon, the hospital cleared a quiet corner of the courtyard and laid out a thermal blanket in the snow. The sun peeked through the clouds, offering a rare moment of warmth. Grace, Beth, Dr. Mitchell, and Ranger stood nearby as the twins sat in the cold, wrapped in coats and scarves, watching the sky. Hope reached out and touched the snow with a bare hand. Hannah leaned into her sister, Bunny tucked under one arm. Beth stood a few feet back, her hands trembling. Then, slowly, Hannah extended her hand toward her mother. Beth didn't move. She waited, unsure. Hope turned, grabbed her mother's other hand, and pulled her gently forward. Together, for the first time since that Christmas Eve 4 years ago, Beth Carter held both her daughters in her arms. No words, just snow, breath, and the quiet, fragile sound of three broken hearts beginning to remember how to beat together again. They called it a miracle. Newspapers across the state ran front-page headlines like, "Twins found alive after 4 years underground," and "Hero K-9 leads detective to secret bunker." News vans crowded the streets of Millbrook Falls. Reporters camped outside the hospital. Microphones chased anyone remotely connected to the case. But inside the town's oldest diner, Mabel's Cafe, where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger, the mood was more complicated. Grace Sullivan sipped from a chipped white mug at the far booth, her eyes fixed on the snowfall outside the window. Ranger lay under the table, head on his paws, tail thumping now and then whenever someone passed. The bell over the door jingled. Sheriff Thomas Bradley walked in, stomped the snow off his boots, and slid into the seat across from her. "You hiding out?" he asked. "More like avoiding small talk," Grace replied. Bradley chuckled, signaling Mabel for coffee. "They're calling you a hero, you know." "Not interested," she said flatly. He leaned back in the booth. "You should be. You stuck with it when nobody else would." Grace looked out the window again. "Yeah, and they're all acting like the town had nothing to do with what happened." Bradley nodded, slower this time. "I've been getting calls from folks all week. Everyone wants to know how they can help. Donations, support groups, therapy funds, you name it." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Now they want to help?" "People are waking up," he said. "I think the silence is starting to feel heavier than the truth." Grace didn't answer. "Not yet." At the Millbrook Falls Community Center, a crowd gathered that night. It wasn't an official town hall, but word had spread fast. Someone had organized a vigil. Not just for the Carter twins, but for the years of silence and guilt that weighed on the town like snow on a collapsing roof. Beth Carter stood near the back of the room, hands folded tightly. Hannah and Hope weren't with her. Dr. Mitchell had recommended short, supervised public exposures, but tonight was too soon. Grace stood by the sidewall, Ranger sitting alert beside her. Mayor Ellen Roy took the mic, her voice shaking slightly. "We gather here tonight not just to light candles, but to confront the truth we've all tried to bury. We failed the Carter family. We stopped looking. We let fear and denial silence our community, and we let a predator walk among us." The room was quiet, no one disagreed. Grace scanned the faces, teachers, coaches, neighbors, people who had once whispered that maybe Beth had made the whole thing up. Now those same people held candles. Dorothy Henderson stepped forward, supported by her cane, and spoke clearly for everyone to hear. "I told people what I saw. I told the sheriff. I told the church committee. I saw William Thornton sneaking into that building late at night. But no one wanted to believe it. Why? Because we liked him. Because he made us feel safe. And because I'm an old woman whose eyes must have been playing tricks." She looked directly at Bradley. "To every person who ignored me, I forgive you. But don't ever do that again to another child or another mother." A slow murmur of agreement swept through the room. Beth Carter's eyes glistened with tears, but for the first time, they weren't from grief. They were from the weightlifting. Someone had finally said it out loud. The next morning, Beth returned to the hospital with a brown paper bag filled with 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and a thermos of hot cocoa. Grace was already in the room when she arrived. Hope and Hannah were watching cartoons, seated cross-legged on the floor. Ranger sat between them, watching the screen with intense curiosity, as if trying to understand how a sponge could wear pants. Beth cleared her throat gently. Hope turned first. "You came back." Beth smiled. "I brought lunch." Hannah didn't speak, but she didn't turn away either. Beth sat on the edge of the hospital bed and opened the bag, handing the sandwiches out with practiced ease. I used to cut the crusts off, she said. You hated crusts. Hope took a bite and chewed slowly. It tastes familiar, she said. Beth's voice wavered. I used to make them every day after school. You'd eat them in front of the TV while I tried to get dinner started. Hannah's voice broke the silence. What was our favorite show? Beth blinked. Well, you loved Dora the Explorer. Hope liked Blue's Clues. But you both got hooked on Sesame Street when you were 6, especially Cookie Monster. Hope cracked a smile. I remember that. Beth nodded, blinking back tears. Grace stayed near the door, heart swelling at the quiet progress. Dr. Mitchell peeked her head in a few minutes later. Hey girls, ready for art therapy? Hannah looked to Beth, then to Grace, then finally to Hope. Can Ranger come too? Of course, the doctor smiled. Ranger rose, stretched, and trotted after them as they walked down the hall. Beth sat on the hospital bed, staring at the half-eaten sandwich in her hand. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Grace sat beside her. You're already doing it. Later that afternoon, Grace returned home to a pile of mail stacked on her kitchen table. Sympathy cards, letters from people she hadn't heard from in years, even a few gift baskets, though most of them were filled with dog treats, which Ranger was thrilled about. She opened one envelope marked with thick handwriting and no return address. Inside was a short note. They say you never stopped looking. Neither did I. I didn't have the courage to say what I knew back then. I'm sorry. If you ever need to talk, I'm ready now. A neighbor. Grace set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. The town had been scared. That was clear now. But fear wasn't an excuse. Not anymore. She stood and walked to the fridge. Pinned beneath a photo of her academy graduation class was a postcard-sized flyer. Retirement party. 6 weeks away. Grace pulled it down. She wasn't ready to retire. Not now. A week later, Beth invited Grace and Ranger to join her and the girls for a walk. It was a cold Saturday morning, but the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days. They walked slowly through the town square, bundled up in scarves and gloves. Hannah kept close to her mother. Hope walked ahead with Ranger occasionally holding the leash. People watched. Some waved. Others just nodded, unsure of what to say. But no one looked away. At the park, Hope paused at the bench where it had all begun. This is where we disappeared, she said. Beth swallowed hard. Yeah. Hope sat down slowly, brushing snow from the bench. Do you think we'll ever feel normal again? Grace crouched beside her. I don't think normal is the right goal, she said. But I do think you'll feel strong and safe. And one day you'll feel happy. That's what matters. Hope looked at her. Hannah joined them. They sat in silence until finally Hope whispered, Can we get a dog? Beth laughed through her tears. We already have one. Ranger barked once, wagging his tail. The girls laughed. And for the first time in 4 years, the sound of joy echoed through Millbrook Falls. Snow blanketed Millbrook Falls that morning, softening rooftops and muffling the sound of tires on Main Street. But inside the Carter house, warmth returned not from the fireplace, but from laughter. Real, unguarded laughter. Hannah and Hope were sitting at the kitchen table building a puzzle together. A few weeks ago, they wouldn't have dared to touch the same object at the same time. Now they were teasing each other over who misplaced the corner piece. Beth stirred pancake batter on the stove, glancing back every so often, as if she still couldn't believe this was real. Grace sat at the counter with a cup of black coffee, wearing the same faded hoodie she always wore off duty. Ranger lay sprawled on the rug by the back door, belly up, paws twitching in a dream. You girls have plans today? Grace asked, smiling behind her mug. Hope grinned. Yeah, Mom said we could take Ranger to the dog park, just us 3. Beth raised an eyebrow. Us 3? Hope tilted her head. You, me, and Hannah. Duh. Grace chuckled. Well, sounds like Ranger's in good hands. Hannah looked up at her. You're still going to visit, right? Grace set her coffee down. I'm not going anywhere. That was true. Grace had turned in her retirement notice to the department, but with a twist, not to quit, but to transfer roles. She'd been appointed the new director of child recovery and victim advocacy, a position created because of this very case. Now she'd use her years of detective work to help families like the Carters, ones the system left behind. And she wouldn't be doing it alone. The courthouse was packed for the sentencing of Guillermo Thornton. News crews waited outside. Some held up signs that read, Justice for Hannah and Hope, while others simply recorded the quiet march of townspeople filing into the old building. This time, no one looked away. Grace entered with Sheriff Bradley, Beth and her lawyer, Hannah and Hope, remained home under the care of Dr. Mitchell. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Thornton looked thinner, older. His hands trembled slightly, chained in front of him. But what chilled Grace most was how calm he appeared, like a man who still believed in his twisted purpose. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and a sharp gaze, didn't waste words. Guillermo Thornton, she said, you manipulated faith, trust, and children to construct a world where you could play God. You isolated two innocent girls and inflicted psychological harm that will take years, if not a lifetime, to repair. Thornton said nothing, just stared straight ahead. I hereby sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck. The room exhaled. But it wasn't applause or cheers that followed. It was silence. Heavy, final, and oddly peaceful. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt still. Outside, Beth stood on the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed her, but she held up a hand. There's nothing more to say about that man, she said firmly. But I will say this. She turned to face the cameras. My daughter survived, not just physically. They're starting to live again. And that's because of one woman and one dog who never gave up on us. Detective Grace Sullivan and K-9 Ranger didn't just find my girls. They reminded this town what it means to care again. Grace, standing off to the side, looked down at Ranger. He gave a low, proud bark. Weeks turned into months. The spring thaw melted away the layers of snow and, in a way, the emotional frost of the community. Millbrook Falls began investing in new programs, trauma-informed school counselors, town watch groups, missing persons task forces, and even a scholarship fund for kids impacted by crime. And in the center of town, where the old water tower stood rusted and forgotten, something new appeared. A bronze statue, life-sized and stunning, was unveiled at a small ceremony. It depicted a young girl holding hands with her twin, both reaching toward the outstretched paw of a German shepherd wearing a vest marked K-9. On the plaque, it read, "For the ones who never stop looking, in honor of Detective Grace Sullivan and K-9 Ranger, and the children who are still waiting to be found." Beth stood beside Grace that day, her daughters flanking her sides. Hannah reached out to touch the bronze figure of the dog. "He looks like Ranger," she whispered. Grace smiled. "He should. They modeled it after him." Ranger didn't seem interested in the statue version of himself. He was too busy sniffing the pockets of children walking by, searching for treats. Later that summer, Grace hosted a barbecue at her home just outside town. Friends, neighbors, officers, and a few of Ranger's K-9 buddies lounged in folding chairs. Smoke from the grill curled into the sky as kids played tag around picnic tables. Hannah and Hope ran barefoot in the grass, shouting over each other as they tried to teach Ranger how to play hide and seek. He humored them, lying in the shade under the porch until bribed with jerky. Beth stepped out of the kitchen, balancing a tray of lemonade. "This might be the most normal day we've had in 5 years, she said, handing Grace a glass. Grace took a sip and nodded. "It's not just normal, it's good." Beth looked out over the yard. "You know, for the longest time, I didn't think we'd get to be a family again. I thought the trauma had eaten that part of us." Grace turned to her, and now? Beth's eyes filled, but they didn't spill. "Now I think we're learning how to be a new kind of family. One that's scarred, maybe, but stronger." She paused. "And I think that starts with telling the truth." That night, Grace found herself sitting alone on the back steps. The party had wound down. The girls had fallen asleep under a blanket on the porch swing. Ranger lay curled near them as if standing guard in his dreams. Sheriff Bradley joined her, handing over a cold beer. "Looks like you built something here," he said. Grace nodded. "It wasn't just me." "No," he agreed, "but it started with you, and a dog who refuses to quit." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars blink into existence. "You think this town's different now?" he asked. Grace took a long sip. "I think it wants to be." A few months later, Hope stood on stage at the middle school auditorium. She wore a simple blue dress and clutched a small note card in her hand, and Hannah stood just behind her, nervous but supportive. The event was called Voices of Resilience, a new town tradition. Hope leaned into the mic. "My name is Hope Carter," she began, "and this is my sister Hannah. A few years ago, something terrible happened to us, but that's not the story we want to tell tonight." She looked over the crowd. "We want to tell you the story of what came after." She smiled at Grace and Ranger, seated in the front row. "The story of people who didn't give up, of healing, of truth, and of a dog who barked at the right door and changed everything. Thank you so much for following this story. We know it wasn't always easy, but the journey toward healing rarely is. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What part of this story moved you the most? Do you believe people in towns can truly change? Would you have kept searching even when everyone else stopped? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us on more powerful journeys where justice, courage, and compassion walk side by side, often on four paws.